Elwood went through the books one by one during school hours, while the boys around him stuttered and stumbled. He had intended to study British literature at the college. Now he had to teach himself. It would have to do. Punishment for acting above your station was a central principle in Harriet's interpretation of the world. In the hospital, Elwood wondered if the viciousness of his beating owed something to his request for harder classes. Get that uppity nigger. Now he worked on a new theory. There was no higher system guiding Nichols' brutality, merely an indiscriminate spite, one that had nothing to do with people. A figment from 10th grade science struck him. A perpetual misery machine, one that operated by itself without human agency. Also, Archimedes, one of his first encyclopedia finds. Violence is the only lever big enough to move the world. He canvassed, but didn't get a clear picture of how to graduate early. Desmond, that scientist of demerit and credit, was no help. You get merits for behavior every week if you do what you're supposed to do right off the bat. But if your house father mixes you up with someone else, or he's out to get you, zip. For demerits, you never know. The demerit scale varied from dormitory to dormitory, smoking, fighting, perpetuating a state of dishevelment. The penalty depended on where they'd sent you and the whims of the local houseman. Blaspheming cost 100 demerits in Cleveland. Blakely was the God-fearing sort, but only 50 in Roosevelt. Jacking off was a flat 200 demerits in Lincoln. But if you were caught jacking someone else off, it was only 100. Only 100. That's Lincoln for you, Desmond said, as if explaining a foreign land, gins, and ducats. Blakely liked his hooch, Elwood noticed. The man was half-mast until noon. Did that mean he couldn't rely on the house father's accounts? Say he stayed out of trouble, Elwood asked. Did everything right. How fast could he climb from the lowest level of grub to the highest level of ace? If everything went perfect, it's too late for perfect if you already went down, Desmond told him. Problem was, even if you avoided trouble, trouble might reach out and snatch you anyway. Another student might sniff out a weakness and start something. One of the staff dislikes your smile and knocks it off your face. You might stumble into a bramble of bad luck, of the sort that got you here in the first place. Elwood decided, by June, he'd climb the merit ladder out of this pit, 4 months short of what that judge gave him. It was comforting. He was accustomed to measuring time according to the school calendar, so a June graduation made his nickel term into a lost year. This time, next fall, he'd be back at Lincoln High School for his senior year, and with Mr. Hill's endorsement, enrolled at Melvin Griggs again. They spent his college money on the lawyer, but if Elwood worked extra next summer, he'd make it back. He had a date. Now he needed a course of action. He felt rotten those first days out of the hospital until he came up with a scheme that combined Turner's advice with what he'd learned from his heroes in the movement. Watch and think and plan. Let the world be a mob. Elwood will walk through it. They might curse and spit and strike him, but he'd make it through to the other side. Bloodied and tired, but he'd make it through. He waited, but no payback came from Lonnie and Black Mike, except for an incident where Griff hip-checked Elwood and sent him crashing down the stairs. They ignored him. Corey, the boy he'd stepped up to defend, winked at him once. Everyone had moved on to girding themselves for the next nickel mishap, the one that was out of their hands. One Wednesday after breakfast, Carter the houseman ordered Elwood over to the warehouse for a new detail. Turner was there, along with a young white man, a lanky sort, with a beatnik slouch and a greasy spray of blonde hair. Elwood had seen him around, smoking in the shade of various buildings. His name was Harper, and according to staff records, he worked in community service. Harper looked Elwood over and said, "He'll do." The supervisor closed the big sliding door to the warehouse, bolted it, and they climbed into the front seat of a grey van. Unlike the other school vehicles, it didn't have Nickel's name painted on it. Elwood sat in the middle. "Here we go," Turner said. He rolled down the window. Harper asked who I thought should replace Smitty, and I said you. I told him you weren't another one of these dummies they got around here. Smitty was an older boy from Roosevelt dormitory next door. He'd hit the highest rank of ace and graduated the week prior, although Elwood thought graduate was a moronic word to use. The boy couldn't read a lick, plain as day. Harper said, "He said, you can keep your mouth shut, which is a requirement." With that, they were off the grounds. Since the hospital, Elwood and Turner hung out most days, killed afternoons in the Cleveland rec room playing checkers and ping-pong with Desmond and some of the other even-tempered boys. Turner usually stumbled into a room as if searching for something, then started bullshitting and forgot whatever errand had brought him there. He was better at chess than Elwood, told better jokes than Desmond, and unlike Jamie, ran on a more consistent schedule. Elwood knew Turner was assigned to community service, but he got cagey when Elwood pressed further. It's taking things and making sure they end up where they're supposed to end up in the end. "What the fuck does that mean?" Jamie said. The boy was not a natural cusser, and his occasional stutter diminished the effect. But of the available vices at Nickel, he had adopted foul language as one of the tamer choices. "It means community service," Elwood said. The immediate meaning of community service was it allowed Elwood to pretend he'd never hitchhiked to college. For a few hours, he was out of Nickel, his first trip out in the free world since his arrival. Free world was prison slang, but it had migrated to the reformatory school because it made sense, transmitted through a boy who'd heard it from a hard-luck father or uncle or from a staff member revealing how he really felt about his charges, despite the school vocabulary Nickel liked to use for itself. The air was cool in Elwood's lungs, and everything outside the window dazzled, renewed. "This or this?" his eye doctor asked at checkups, a choice between two lenses of different power. Elwood never ceased to marvel how you could walk around and get used to seeing only a fraction of the world, not knowing you only saw a sliver of the real thing. This or this? Definitely this, all that the van tumbled past, the sudden majesty of everything, even the falling down shotgun shacks and sad concrete blockhouses, the junker cars, half in the weeds in someone's yard. He saw a rusty sign for Wild Cherry High C and was more thirsty than he'd ever been in his life. Harper noticed the shift in Elwood's posture. "He likes being out," the supervisor said, and he and Turner laughed. He turned on the radio. Elvis was singing. Harper slapped the steering wheel in time. In temperament, Harper was an unlikely Nickel employee. All right for a white man, in Turner's estimation. He practically grew up on the grounds, raised by his mother's sister, a secretary in the administration building. He spent untold afternoons on the grounds as a mascot to the white students and picked up odd work when he was old enough. Painted reindeer in the annual Christmas display ever since he could hold a brush. Now he was 20 years old and worked full-time. "My aunt says I'm a get-along type," he told the boys one shift while they idled outside the 5 and 10. "I suppose I am. I grew up around you boys, white and colored, and I know you're just like me, but you had some bad luck." They made 4 stops around the town of Eleanor before the fire chief's house. First was John Diner, a rusty outline attested to a fallen-off letter and an apostrophe. They parked down the alley and Elwood got a look at the van's cargo: cartons and crates of Nichols' kitchen stores, cans of peas, industrial tins of peaches, applesauce, baked beans, gravy. A selection of this week's shipment from the state of Florida. Harper lit a cigarette and put his ear to a transistor radio. Game on today. Turner handed boxes of green beans and sacks of onions down to Elwood before they brought them into the back entrance of the restaurant kitchen. "Don't forget the molasses," Harper said. When they finished, the owner emerged, a porky redneck whose apron was a palimpsest of dark stains, and clapped Harper on the back. He handed Harper an envelope and asked about his family. "You know Aunt Lucille," Harper said, "supposed to stay off her feet and never stays put for anything." The next two stops were also restaurants, a barbecue stand and a meat and three-joint over the county line, and then they unloaded a store of canned vegetables at the Top Shop grocery. Harper folded each envelope of cash in half, snapped a rubber band around it, and tossed it into the glove compartment before the next destination. Turner let the work speak for itself. Harper wanted to be certain about Elwood's comfort with his new detail. "You don't look surprised," the young white man said. "It has to end up somewhere," Elwood responded. "How things are done. Spencer tells me where to go, and he kicks it up to Director Hardy." Harper fiddled the dial after more rock and roll. Elvis popped up again. He was everywhere. "It used to be worse in the old days," Harper said, "from what my aunt says. But the state cracked down, and now we lay off the South Campus stuff," meaning they only sold the black students' supplies. "We had this good old boy who used to run Nickel, Roberts, who would have sold the air you breathe if he could have. Now that was a crook." "Beats cleaning the toilets," Turner said. "Beats cutting grass, if you ask me." It was nice to be out, and Elwood said so. In the coming months, Elwood saw all of Eleanor, Florida, as their three-man crew made the rounds. He got to know the back of the short Main Street as Harper parked by the service entrances. Sometimes they unloaded notebooks and pencils, sometimes medicine and bandages, but mostly it was food. Thanksgiving turkeys and Christmas hams disappeared into the hands of fry cooks, and the assistant principal of the elementary school opened a box of erasers and counted them one by one. Elwood wondered why the boys had no toothpaste. Now he knew. They parked behind the 5 and 10, Fisher's Drugs, and phoned ahead to the local doctor, who slithered up to the driver's window with a furtive air. Once in a while, they stopped at a green 3-story house on a dead-end street, and Harper got paid by a well-groomed city council type in a sweater vest. Harper didn't know the guy's story, he said, but the man had good manners, crisp bills, and liked to talk Florida teams. This or this. Every time he left school property, the new lens popped into place, and all it permitted him to see. The first day, when the back of the van was empty, Elwood assumed they'd returned to Nickel, but they headed to a clean, quiet street that reminded him of the nicer parts of Tallahassee, the white part. They pulled up at a big white house that floated on a sea of undulating green. An American flag sighed on a pole attached to the roof. They got out, and another look in the recesses of the van revealed a canvas tarp that hid painting supplies. "Mrs. Davis," Harper said, bowing his head. A white lady with a beehive hairdo waved from the front porch. "This is so exciting," she said. Elwood didn't make eye contact as she led them around the back of the yard, where a gray, tired-looking gazebo perched at the edge of the oak trees. "That it?" Harper asked. "My grandfather built it 40 years ago," Mrs. Davis said. "Conrad proposed to me right there." She wore a yellow dress with a houndstooth pattern and dark sunglasses like Jackie Kennedy. She spotted a thin green bug on her shoulder, flicked it off, and smiled. a new paint job was in order. Mrs. Davis gave Harper a broom, Harper gave Elwood the broom, and Elwood swept the decking while Turner got the paint from the van. "You boys are so nice to help us out here," Mrs. Davis told them before she returned to the house. "I'll be back around 3, Harper said. Then he was gone too. Turner explained that Harper had a girlfriend on Maple. Her man worked at one of the factories and kept long hours. "We're going to paint," Elwood said. "Yeah, man." "He's leaving us here." "Yeah, man. Mr. Davis is the fire chief. He has us out here a lot doing little stuff. Smitty and I did all the rooms on the top floor." He pointed to the dormer windows, as if it were possible for Elwood to appraise his handiwork. "All those guys on the school board, they have us do chores. Sometimes it's some bullshit, but I'll take being out here over any job back at school." As did Elwood. It was a humid November afternoon, and he savored the free world sounds of bugs and birds. Their mating calls and warnings were soon accompanied by Turner's whistling. Chuck Berry, if Elwood was not mistaken. The brand of paint was Dixie, the color Dixie White. The last time Elwood had done any painting, he'd given Mrs. Lamont's outhouse a new coat, a chore for which his grandmother had loaned him out for 10 cents. Turner laughed and told Elwood how in the olden days the school sent teams of boys into Eleanor all the time to do work for the big shots. According to Harper, sometimes it was favors, like this paint job, but a lot of time it was for real money, which schools kept for their upkeep, same as the money from the crops and the printing jobs and the bricks. Further back, it was more gruesome. When you graduated, you didn't go back to your family. You had parole, where they basically sold your monkey ass to people in town. Work like a slave, live in their basement or whatever, beat you, kick you, feed you shit. Shit food like we get now? Hell no, way worse. You had to work off your debt, he said. Then they let you go. Debt from what? That stumped him. I never thought about it that way. He stayed Elwood's arm. You don't want to go too fast, he said. This can be a 3-day job. We play it right. Mrs. Davis brings out lemonade. When 2 glasses of lemonade appeared on a bronze tray, it was excellent. They finished the railings and lattice of the walls. Elwood shook a new can of Dixie White, pried it open, and stirred. He'd told Turner how he got pinched and sent to nickel. Man, that's a raw deal. But Turner never talked about his old life. This was his 2nd term at the school, after being out almost a year. Maybe asking about how he got snatched back was a way in. The nickel undertow sucked up everything, and his friend's past might get pulled into the story. Turner sat down at Elwood's question. You know what a pin setter is? In a bowling alley, Elwood said. I was working as a pin setter in a bowling alley down in Tampa, the Holiday. Most places, they got the machine that does it, but Mr. Garfield was hanging in there. He liked to see his pin boys crouch at the end of the lane like we were sprinters, or dogs about to go out hunting. It wasn't a bad job, picking up the pins after each throw and setting them up for the next frame. Mr. Garfield was a friend of the Everetts, where I was living. The state paid the Everetts money to take in kids. Some money, not a lot. There were always a lot of us strays around, coming and going. Like I said, it was a good job. Thursday was colored night, and everybody came from all around, the different colored bowling leagues, and that was a good time, but mostly it was these stupid rednecks from Tampa. Some bad, some less bad. White people. I was pretty fast, and I find it easy to smile when I'm working, being somewhere else in my thoughts while I'm doing whatever, and the customers liked me. They gave me tips. I got to know some of the regulars. Not like know them, but we saw each other every week. Like that. I started goofing off with them. If it was a guy I knew, I might make a joke when they fouled, or make some clown face like this when they threw a gutter or had some funny-looking split. That became my routine, joking around with the regulars, and I liked the tips. There was this old head who worked in the kitchen. His name was Lou. One of those dudes have seen some shit. He didn't talk much to us pinboys. He flipped burgers. Because he wasn't too friendly, we didn't conversate much. This one night, I was on my break, and I go out for a cigarette behind the grill, and he's there, in this apron, covered with grease. It was a hot night, and he looks me up and down. He says to me, "I see you out there, nigger, putting on a show. Why you always shucking and jiving for these white people? Ain't nobody ever teach you self-respect?" Two other setters are out there, and they hear this. They're like, "Damn." My face got all hot. I was ready to punch this old fool. He doesn't know me, don't know shit about me. I look at him, and he ain't moving, standing there smoking this cigarette he rolled, and he knows I'm not going to do anything, because he's right in what he said. Next time I was on a shift, I don't know, I started doing it differently. Instead of joking with them, I was mean. When they hit the gutter or stepped over the line, there was nothing friendly in my face. I saw in their eyes when they realized the game had changed. Maybe we'd pretended to be on the same side before, and it was all equal, but now it wasn't. End of the night, I'd been taunting this fucking Peckerwood the whole game. This big hee-haw meathead. It's his turn, and he has to pick up a 4-6 split. I said, "Ain't that a stinker," like Bugs Bunny, and that's it for him. He comes charging up the lane. He's chasing me around the place. I'm jumping from lane to lane, up in everybody's business, dodging balls, and then finally his friends hold him back. They come there all the time. They're not trying to make things hard for Mr. Garfield. They know me, or thought they knew me until I started not acting right, and they get their friend and cool him out and leave. Turner grinned as he acted out the story, until the last part. He squinted at the floor of the gazebo as if trying to make out something tiny. "That was the end of it, really," he said, scratching the nick in his ear. "Next week I saw that guy's car in the parking lot, and I threw a cinder block through the window, and the cops picked me up. Harper was an hour late. They weren't going to complain. Free time at Nickel on one side, work time in the free world on the other. It was an easy calculation. "Going to need a ladder?" Elwood told Harper when he showed up. "Sure," Harper said. Mrs. Davis waved from the porch as they pulled away. "How's your lady, Harper?" Turner asked. Harper tucked in his shirt tail. Just when you ease into a good time, they bring up some whole other thing they've been thinking about since the last time you saw them. "Sure, I know," Turner said. He reached for Harper's cigarettes and lit one. Elwood grabbed everything he saw in the free world to reassemble it in his mind later. What things looked like, and what things smelled like, and other things as well. 2 days later, Harper told him he was on community service permanently. But then, white men had always noticed his industrious nature. The news brightened his mood. Each time they returned to Nickel, he wrote down the particulars in a composition book. The date, the name of the individual, and the establishment. Some names took a while to fill in, but Elwood had always been the patient type, and thorough. Chapter 9T. He boys rooted for Griff, even though he was a miserable bully who jimmied and pried at their weaknesses and made up weaknesses if he couldn't find any, such as calling you a knock-kneed piece of shit, even if your knees had never knocked your whole life. He tripped them and laughed at the ensuing pratfalls and slapped them around when he could get away with it. He punked them out, dragging them into dark rooms. He smelled like a horse and made fun of their mothers, which was pretty low, given the general motherlessness of the student population. He stole their desserts on multiple occasions, swiped from trays with a grin, and even if the desserts in question were no great shakes, it was the principle. The boys rooted for Griff because he was going to represent the colored half of nickel at the annual boxing match, and no matter what he did the rest of the year, the day of the fight, he was all of them in one black body, and he was going to knock that white boy out. If Griff spat teeth before that happened, swell. The colored boys had held the nickel title for 15 years. Old hands on staff remembered the last white champion and still talked him up. Other things from the old days they discussed less often. Terry Doc Burns was an anvil-handed good old boy from a musty corner of Suwannee County who'd been sent to nickel for strangling a neighbor's chickens. 21 chickens, to be exact, because they were out to get him. Pain rolled off him like rain from a slate roof. After Doc Burns returned to the free world, the white boys who advanced to the final fight were pikers, so wobbly that over the years, tall tales about the former champion grew more extravagant. Nature had gifted Doc Burns with an unnaturally long reach. He did not tire. His legendary combo swatted down every comer and rattled windows. In fact, Doc Burns had been beaten and ill-treated by so many in his life, family and stranger alike, that by the time he arrived at nickel, all punishments were gentle breezes. This was Griff's first term on the boxing team. He arrived at nickel in February, right after the graduation of the previous champ, Axel Parks. Axel should have graduated before fighting season, but Roosevelt's houseman made sure he was around to defend his title. An accusation of stealing apples from the dining hall knocked him down to grub and guaranteed his availability. Griff's emergence as the baddest brother on campus made him Axel's natural successor. Outside the ring, Griff made a hobby of terrorizing the weaker boys, the boys without friends, the weepy ones. Inside the ring, his prey stepped right up so he didn't waste time hunting. Like an electric toaster or an automated washing machine, boxing was a modern convenience that made life easier. The coach for the colored team was a Mississippian named Max David, who worked in the school garage. He got an envelope at the end of the year for imparting what he'd learned during his welterweight stint. Max David made his pitch to Griff early in the summer. "My first fight made me cock-eyed," he said, "and my farewell fight set my eyes right again. So trust me when I say this sport will break you down to make you better, and that's a fact." Griff smiled. The giant pulverized and unmanned his opponents with cruel inevitability through autumn. He was not graceful, he was not a scientist, he was a powerful instrument of violence, and that sufficed given the typical length of enrollment at nickel. Sabotage by staff aside, most students were only around for 1 or 2 fighting seasons. As the championship approached, the grubs had to be schooled in the importance of those December matches. The prelims inside your dorm, the match between your dorm's guy and the best sluggers from the other 2 dorms, and then the bout between the best black fighter and whatever chump the white guys put up. The championship would be their sole acquaintance with justice at nickel. The combat served as a kind of mollifying spell to tide them through the daily humiliations. Trevor Nickel instituted the championship matches in 1946, soon after he came on as the director of the Florida Industrial School for Boys with a mandate for reform. Nickel had never run a school before. His background was in agriculture. He made an impression at clan meetings, however, with his impromptu speeches on moral improvement and the value of work, the disposition of young souls in need of care. The right people remembered his passion when an opening came up. His first Christmas at the school gave the county the chance to witness his improvements. Everything that needed a new coat of paint got a new coat of paint. The dark cells were briefly converted to more innocent use, and the beatings relocated to the small, white utility building. Had the good people of Eleanor seen the industrial fan, they might have had a question or two, but the shed was not part of the tour. Nickel was a long-time boxing evangelist, had steered a lobbying group for its expansion in the Olympics. Boxing had always been popular at the school, as most of the boys had seen their share of scrapes, but the new director took the sport's elevation as his remit. The athletics budget, long an easy target for directors on the skim, was rejiggered to pay for regulation equipment and to bolster the coaching staff. Nickel maintained a general interest in fitness overall. He possessed a fervent belief in the miracle of a human specimen in top shape, and often watched the boys shower to monitor the progress of their physical education. "The director?" Elwood asked when Turner told him that last part. "Where do you think Dr. Campbell got that trick from?" Turner said. Nickel was gone, but Dr. Campbell, the school psychologist, was known to loiter at the white boys' showers to pick his dates. All these dirty old men got a club together. Elwood and Turner were hanging out on the gymnasium bleachers this afternoon. Griff sparred with Cherry, a mulatto who took up boxing as a matter of pedagogy to teach others how not to speak about his white mother. He was quick and lithe, and Griff clobbered him. Catching Griff at his regimen was Cleveland's favorite occupation those early days in December. Boys from the colored dormitories made the rounds, as well as white scouts from down the hill who wanted the skinny. Griff had been excused from his kitchen shift since Labor Day to train. It was a spectacle. Max kept him on an obscure diet of raw eggs and oats and stored a jug of what he claimed was goat blood in the icebox. When the coach administered the doses, Griff swallowed the stuff with a lot of theater and mortified the heavy bag in revenge. Turner had seen Axel fight during his first term at Nickel 2 years prior. Axel was slow on his feet, but as solid and abiding as an old stone bridge. He weathered what the skies decreed. Contrary to Griff's mealy disposition, he was kind and protective of the smaller kids. "I wonder where he is now," Turner said. "That nigger doesn't have a lick of sense, making things worse for himself, probably, wherever he is." A Nickel tradition. Cherry wavered and sank on his ass. Griff spat out his mouthpiece and bellowed. Black Mike stepped into the sparring ring and held Griff's hand up like Lady Liberty's torch. "Do you think he'll knock him down?" Elwood asked. The likely white contender was a boy named Big Chet, who came from a clan of swamp people and was a bit of a creature. "Look at those arms, man," Turner said. "Those things are pistons, or smoked hams." To see Griff quiver with unspent energy after a match, 2 chucks unlacing his gloves like retainers, it was hard to imagine how the giant could lose. Which is why, 2 days later, Turner sat up in surprise when he heard Spencer tell Griff to take a dive. Turner was napping in the warehouse loft, where he'd made a nest among crates of industrial scrubbing powder. None of the staff bugged him when he went alone into the big storage room on account of his work with Harper, which meant Turner had a getaway place. No supervisors, no students, just him, a pillow, an army blanket, and Harper's transistor radio. He spent a couple of hours a week up there. It was like when he was tramping and didn't care to know anybody and no one cared to know him. He'd had a few periods like that, when he was rootless and tumbled down the street like an old newspaper. The loft took him back. The closing of the warehouse door woke him. Then came Griff's dumb donkey voice. "What is it, Mr. Spencer, sir?" "How's that training coming along, Griff? Good old Max says you're a natural." Turner frowned. Any time a white man asked you about yourself, they were about to fuck you over. Griff was so stupid he didn't know what was happening. In class, the boy struggled over 2 plus 3, like he didn't know how many damned fingers he had on his hand. Some foolhardies in the schoolhouse laughed at him then, and Griff stuck their heads into toilets, one by one, over the next week. Turner's assessment was correct. Griff refused to grasp the reason for the secret meeting. Spencer expounded about the importance of the fight, the tradition of the December match. Then he hinted, good sportsmanship means letting the other team win sometimes. He tried euphemism. It's like when a tree branch has to bend so it doesn't break. He appealed to fatalism. Sometimes it don't work out, no matter how much you try. But Griff was too thick. Yes, sir. I suppose that's right, Mr. Spencer. I believe that is the case, sir. Finally, the superintendent told Griff that his black ass had to take a dive in the 3rd round, or else they'd take him out back. Yes, sir, Mr. Spencer, Griff said. Up in the loft, Turner couldn't see Griff's face, so he didn't know if he understood. The boy had stones in his fists and rocks in his head. Spencer ended with, you know you can beat him. That'll have to be enough. He cleared his throat and said, you come along now, as if herding a lamb who'd wandered. Turner was alone again. Ain't that some shit, he said. He and Elwood were lounging on Cleveland's front steps after a run to Eleanor. The daylight was thin, winter coming down like the lid on an old pot. Elwood was the only person Turner could tell. The rest of these mutts would blab, and then there'd be a lot of busted heads. Turner had never met a kid like Elwood before. Sturdy was the word he returned to, even though the Tallahassee boy looked soft, conducted himself like a goody-goody, and had an irritating tendency to preach. Wore eyeglasses you wanted to grind underfoot like a butterfly. He talked like a white college boy, read books when he didn't have to, and mined them for uranium to power his own personal A-bomb. Still sturdy. Elwood wasn't surprised at Turner's news. Organized boxing is corrupt on every level, he said with authority. There's been a lot in the newspapers about it. He described what he'd read back at Marconi's, perched on his stool during the dead hours. Only reason to fix a fight is because you're betting on it. I'd bet on it if I had any money, Turner said. Sometimes at the holiday, we put money on the playoffs. I got paid. People are going to be upset, Elwood said. Griff's victory was sure to be a feast, but almost as delicious were the morsels the boys traded in anticipation. The scenarios in which the white contender lost control of his bowels or threw up a geyser of blood in Director Hardy's face, or white teeth flew from his mouth like they were chipped out with an ice pick. Fantasies hearty and fortifying. Sure, Turner said, but Spencer says he's going to take you out back. You listen. Take him to the White House? I'll show you, Turner said. They had some time before supper. They walked 10 minutes to the laundry, which was shut at this time of day. Turner asked Elwood about the book under his arm, and Elwood said a British family was trying to marry off their oldest daughter to keep their estate and title. The story had complicated turns. No one wants to marry her? She ugly? She's described as having a handsome face. Damn! Past the laundry were the dilapidated horse stables. The ceiling had given way long ago, and nature had crept inside, with skeletal bushes and limp grasses rising in the stalls. You could get up to some wickedness in there if you didn't believe in ghosts, but none of the students had arrived at a definite opinion on the matter, so everyone stayed away to be safe. There were 2 oaks on one side of the stables, with iron rings stabbed into the bark. This is out back, Turner said. They say once in a while they take a black boy here and shackle him up to those, arms spread out. Then they get a horsewhip and tear him up. Elwood made 2 fists, then caught himself. No white boys? The White House? They got that integrated. This place is separate. They take you out back. They don't bring you to the hospital. They put you down as escaped, and that's that, boy. What about their family? How many boys you know here got family, or got family that cares about them? Not everyone is you, Elwood. Turner got jealous when Elwood's grandmother visited and brought him snacks, and it slipped out from time to time, like now. The blinders Elwood wore, walking around. The law was one thing. You can march and wave signs around and change a law if you convinced enough white people. In Tampa, Turner saw the college kids with their nice shirts and ties sit in at the Woolworths. He had to work, but they were out protesting. And it happened, they opened the counter. Turner didn't have the money to eat there either way. You can change the law, but you can't change people and how they treat each other. Nickel was racist as hell. Half the people who worked here probably dressed up like the Klan on weekends. But the way Turner saw it, wickedness went deeper than skin color. It was Spencer. It was Spencer, and it was Griff, and it was all the parents who let their children wind up here. It was people, which is why Turner brought Elwood out to the two trees, to show him something that wasn't in books. Elwood grabbed one of the rings and tugged. It was solid, part of the trunk now. Human bones would break before it came loose. Harper confirmed the gambling 2 days later. They'd unloaded a few hogs at Terry's BBQ. "Delivered unto them," Turner said, when Harper closed the van door. Their hands reeked of slaughter smell, and he asked about the fight. "I'll put down some money when I see who shakes out for the big one," Harper said. Betting was small time when Director Nickel ran things, purity of the sport, etc. Nowadays, the fat cats turned out, anyone in 3 counties with a taste for wagering. Well, not anyone. Someone on staff had to vouch for you. You always bet on the colored boy anyway, though. Be foolish not to. "All boxing is fixed," Elwood said. "Crooked as a country preacher," Turner added. "They wouldn't do that," Harper said. This was his childhood he was talking about. He grew up on those matches, chomping popped corn in the VIP section. "It's a beautiful thing." Turner snorted and started whistling. The big match was split up over 2 nights. On the first, the white campus and black campus settled who to send to the main event. For the last 2 months, 3 boxing rings had been set up in the gymnasium for training. Now, only one remained in the center of the big room. It was chilly outside, and the spectators stepped into the humid cavern. White men from town claimed the folding chairs closest to the ring, then came staff, and beyond that, the student body crammed into the bleachers, squatted on the floors, ashy elbow to ashy elbow. The racial division of the school created itself in the gym, with white boys taking the south half and black boys claiming the north. They jostled at the borders. Director Hardy acted as master of ceremonies. He rarely left his office in the administration building. Turner hadn't seen him since Halloween, when he dressed in a Dracula outfit and distributed sweaty handfuls of candy corn to the younger students. He was a short man, fastened into his suits, with a bald pate that floated in a cloud bank of white hair. Hardy had brought his wife, a robust beauty whose every visit was thoroughly annotated by the students, if furtively, reckless eyeballing called for mandatory beatings. She'd been Miss South Louisiana, or so the story went. She cooled her neck with a paper fan. The Hardys enjoyed a prime spot in front with the board members. Turner recognized most of them from raking their yards or delivering a ham. Where their pink necks emerged from the linen, that's where you strike, the vulnerable inch. Harper sat behind the VIP row with the rest of the staff. He carried himself differently in the company of his fellow supervisors, dropping his shirker's affect. Many an afternoon, Turner had seen the man's face and posture click into its proper place when a houseman or supervisor showed up. A snap to, dropping a disguise, or taking one up. Hardy made a few remarks. The chairman of the board, Mr. Charles Grayson, the manager of the bank and a long-time nickel supporter, was turning 60 on Friday. Hardy made the students sing Happy Birthday. Mr. Grayson stood and nodded, hands behind his back, like a dictator. The white dormitories were up first. Big Chet squeezed between the ropes and bounded into the center of the ring. His cheerleaders expressed themselves with gusto. He commanded a legion. The white boys didn't get it as bad as the black boys, but they were not in nickel because the world cared overmuch. Big Chet was their great white hope. Gossip nailed him for a sleepwalker, punching holes in the bathroom walls without waking. Morning found him sucking on his bloody knuckles. "Nigger looks like Frankenstein," Turner said. Square head, long arms, loping. The opening fight went 3 unremarkable rounds. The ref, who managed the floor of the printing plant in the daytime, gave the decision to Big Chet, and no one argued otherwise. He was regarded as an even personality, the ref, ever since he slapped a kid, and his fraternity ring left the kid half blind. After that, he bent a knee to our savior and never again raised a hand in anger except at his wife. The white boys' second match opened with a pop, a pneumatic uppercut that whisked Big Chet's opponent into a childhood fear. He spent the remainder of the round and the next 2 skittering like a rabbit. At the ref's decision, Big Chet rummaged in his mouth and spat out his mouthpiece in 2 pieces. He raised his big old arms to the sky. "I think he could take Griff," Elwood said. "Maybe he can, but they have to make sure. If you had the power to make people do what you wanted and never exercised it, what was the point of having it?" Griff's bouts with the champs of Roosevelt and Lincoln were brief affairs. Pettibone stood a foot shorter than Griff, an obvious mismatch when you saw them toe-to-toe, but he'd climbed the Roosevelt heap, and that was that. At the bell, Griff barreled out and humiliated his quarry with a battery of zip-zip-zip body blows. The crowd winced. "He's having ribs for dinner," a boy behind Turner shouted. Mrs. Hardy shrieked when Pettibone floated up dreamily on his tippy toes and then toppled to kiss the dirty mat. The second match was less lopsided. Griff tenderized the Lincoln boy like a cheap cut of meat for 3 rounds, but Wilson stayed on his feet to prove his worth to his father. Wilson had 2 bouts going, the one everybody could see and the one only he could. His father had been dead for years and was thus unable to revise his assessment of his firstborn son's character. But that night, Wilson slept without nightmares for the first time in years. The ref gave the fight to Griff with a concerned smile. Turner surveyed the room and took in the assembled marks, the boys and the betters. "You run a rigged game, you got to give the suckers a taste." Back in Tampa, a few blocks down from the Everett's house, a street hustler conducted rounds of "Find the Lady" outside a cigar store, taking suckers' money all day, weaving those cards around on a cardboard box. The rings on his fingers sparkled and shouted in the sun. Turner liked to hover and take in the show, track the hustler's eyes, track the mark's eyes as he tried to follow the Queen of Hearts. Then they turned over their card. How their faces collapsed when they saw they weren't as smart as they thought. The hustler told Turner to beat it, but as the weeks went on, he got bored and let the boy hang around. "You got to let them think they know what's going on," he told Turner one day. "They see it with their own eyes, distract themselves with that, so they can't see the bigger game." When the cops hauled him to jail, His cardboard box lay in the alley around the corner for weeks. With tomorrow's fight set, Turner was transported back to that street corner. Watching a game of Find the Lady, neither Hustler nor Mark outside the game, but knowing all its rules. The next evening, the white men will put up their money, and the black boys will put up their hopes, and then the confidence man turns over the ace of spades and rakes it all in. Turner remembered the excitement of Axel's fight 2 years ago, the deranged joy in the realization that they were allowed to have something for a change. They were happy for a few hours, spending time in the free world. Then it was back to nickel. Suckers, all of them. The morning of Griff's big match, the black students woke up, wrung out from sleeplessness, and the dining hall bubbled with chatter over the dimension and magnitude of Griff's looming triumph. That white boy's going to be toothless as my old granny. The witch doctor can give him the whole bucket of aspirin, and he'll still have a headache. The Ku Klux Klan's going to be crying under their hoods all week. The colored boys frothed and speculated and stared off in class, slacked off in the sweet potato fields, mulling the prospect of a black champion, one of them victorious for a change, and those who kept you down whittled to dust, seeing stars. Griff strutted like a black duke, a gang of chucks in his wake. The younger kids threw punches at their private invisible adversaries and made up a song about their new hero's prowess. Griff hadn't bloodied or mistreated anyone outside of the ring in a week, as if he'd sworn on a Bible, and Black Mike and Lonnie curbed themselves in solidarity. By all accounts, Griff was unbothered by Spencer's order, or so it seemed to Elwood. "It's like he forgot," he whispered to Turner as they walked to the warehouse after breakfast. "If I got all this respect, I'd enjoy it too," Turner said. The next day, it would be as if it never happened. He remembered Axel the afternoon after his big fight, stirring a wheelbarrow of cement, gloomy and diminished once more. "When's the next time fools who hate and fear you are going to treat you like Harry Belafonte?" Or he forgot, Elwood said. That evening, they filed into the gymnasium. Some of the kitchen boys operated a big kettle, cranking out popcorn and scooping it into paper cones. The Chucks chomped it down and raced to the back of the line for seconds. Turner, Elwood, and Jamie squeezed together in the middle of the bleachers. It was a good spot. "Hey, Jamie, aren't you supposed to be sitting over there?" Turner asked. Jamie grinned. "Way I see it, I win either way." Turner crossed his arms and scanned the faces on the floor. There was Spencer. He shook hands with the fat cats in the front row, the director and his wife, and then sat with the staff, smug and sure. He withdrew a silver flask from his windbreaker and took a pull. The bank manager handed out cigars. Mrs. Hardy took one, and everyone watched her blow smoke. Wispy grey figures twirled in the overhead light, living ghosts. On the other side of the room, the white boys stomped their feet on the wood, and the thunder bounced off the walls. The black boys picked it up, and the stomping rolled around the room in a staggered stampede. It traveled a full circuit before the boys stopped and cheered at their racket. "Send him to the undertaker." The ref rang the bell. The two fighters were the same height and build, hacked from the same quarry. An even match, the track record of colored champions notwithstanding. Those opening rounds, there was no dancing or ducking. The boys bit into each other again and again, trading attacks, bucking the pain. The crowd bellowed and jeered at every advance and reversal. Black Mike and Lonnie hung on the ropes, hooting scatological invective at Big Chet, until the ref kicked their hands away. If Griff feared knocking out Big Chet by accident, he gave no sign. The black giant battered the white boy without mercy, absorbed his opponent's counter-assault, jabbed at the kid's face as if punching his way through the wall of a prison cell. When blood and sweat blinded him, he maintained an eerie sense of Big Chet's position and fended the boy off. At the end of the second round, you had to call the fight for Griff, despite Big Chet's admirable offensives. "Making it look good," Turner said. Elwood frowned in disdain at the whole performance, which made Turner smile. The fight was as rigged and rotten as the dishwashing races he'd told Turner about, another gear in the machine that kept black folks down. Turner enjoyed his friend's new bend towards cynicism, even as he found himself swayed by the magic of the big fight. Seeing Griff, their enemy and champion, put a hurting on that white boy made a fellow feel all right, in spite of himself. Now that the third and final round was upon them, he wanted to hold on to that feeling. It was real, in their blood and minds, even if it was a lie. Turner was certain Griff was going to win, even though he knew he wasn't. Turner was a mark after all, another sucker, but he didn't care. Big Chet advanced on Griff and unfurled a series of quick jabs that drove him into his corner. Griff was trapped, and Turner thought, now. But the black boy gathered his opponent in a clinch and remained on his feet. Body blows sent the white boy reeling. The round dwindled into seconds, and Griff did not relent. Big Chet squashed his nose with a thunk, and Griff shook it off. Each time Turner saw the perfect moment to take a dive, Big Chet's rigorous assault would cover even the worst acting. Griff refused the opening. Turner nudged Elwood, who had a look of horror on his face. They saw it. Griff wasn't going down. He was going to go for it, no matter what happened after. When the bell sounded for the last time, the two nickel boys in the ring were entwined, bloody and slick, propping each other up like a human teepee. The ref split them, and they stumbled crazily to their corners, spent. Turner said, "Damn." "Maybe they called it off," Elwood said. "Sure, it was possible the ref was in on it, and they decided to fix it that way instead." Spencer's reaction dispelled that theory. The superintendent was the only person in the second row still sitting, a malignant scowl screwed into his face. One of the fat cats turned around, red-faced, and grabbed his arm. Griff jerked to his feet, lumbered to the center of the ring, and shouted. The noise of the crowd smothered his words. Black Mike and Lonnie held back their friend, who appeared to have lost his wits. He struggled to cross the ring. The ref called for everyone to settle down and delivered his decision. The first 2 rounds went to Griff, the last to Big Chet. The black boys had prevailed. Instead of cavorting around the canvas in triumph, Griff squirmed free and traversed the ring to where Spencer sat. Now Turner heard his words. "I thought it was the second. I thought it was the second." He was still screaming as the black boys led him back to Roosevelt, cheering and whooping for their champion. They had never seen Griff cry before and took his tears for those of triumph. Getting hit in the head can rattle your brains. Getting hit in the head like that can make you addle-minded and confused. Turner never thought it'd make you forget 2 + 1. But Griff had never been good at arithmetic, he supposed. He was all of them in one black body that night in the ring, and all of them when the white men took him out back to those 2 iron rings. They came for Griff that night, and he never returned. The story spread that he was too proud to take a dive, that he refused to kneel, and if it made the boys feel better to believe that Griff escaped, broke away, and ran off into the free world, no one told them otherwise, although some noted that it was odd the school never sounded the alarm or sent out the dogs. When the state of Florida dug him up 50 years later, the forensic examiner noted the fractures in the wrists and speculated that he'd been restrained before he died. In addition, to the other violence attested by the broken bones. Most of those who know the story of the rings in the trees are dead by now. The iron is still there, rusty, deep in the heartwood, testifying to anyone who cares to listen. Chapter 10. Miscreants had bashed in the reindeers' heads. They expected a certain amount of wear and tear after the holiday when the boys gathered to pack the delicate Christmas displays. Bent antlers, a leg twisting from shreds at the joint. What lay before them was malicious vandalism. "Look at this," Miss Baker said. She sucked her teeth. Miss Baker was on the young side for a nickel teacher, with a predilection for simmering outrage. At nickel, her dependable ire stemmed from the regrettable condition of the colored art room, the haphazard supplies, and what could only be interpreted as institutional resistance to her various improvements. The young teachers never lasted long before they moved on. All this hard work. Turner pulled out the balled-up newspaper from the reindeer skull and unwrinkled it. The headline rendered a verdict on the first Nixon and Kennedy debate. Rout. "This one's a goner," he said. Elwood raised his hand. "Do you want us to make all new ones, or just new heads, Miss Baker?" "I think the bodies we can salvage," she said. She grimaced and twisted her curly red hair into a bun. "Just do the heads, touch up the fur on the bodies, and next year we'll start from scratch." Visitors from all over the Panhandle, families from Georgia and Alabama, caravanned every year to take in the annual Christmas fair. It was the pride of the administration. A fundraising bounty that proved reform was no mere lofty notion, but a workable proposition. A bit of an operation, gears and gears. 5 miles of colored lights dangled from the cedars and traced the roofs of the South Campus. The 30-foot Santa at the foot of the drive required a crane to fit it together. The assembly instructions for the miniature steam train that looped around the football field were passed through the decades like the scrolls of a solemn sect. Last year's display attracted more than 100,000 guests to the property. There was no reason, Director Hardy insisted, that the good boys of the Nickel Academy couldn't improve on that number. The white students handled construction and the reassembly of the large displays, the gigantic sleigh, the nativity diorama, the train tracks, and the black students did most of the painting. Touch-ups, new additions, correcting the artistic errors of previous, less meticulous boys, and refurbing the old workhorses. 3-foot-high candy canes lined each dormitory walkway, and they invariably required new dabs of red and white paint. The monstrous poster-sized Christmas cards featured North Pole shenanigans, fairy tale favorites like Hansel and Gretel and the 3 Little Pigs, and biblical recreations. The cards tilted on stands along the school roads as if adorning the lobby of a grand theater. The students loved this time of year, whether it reminded them of Christmases back home, miserable as they were, or it was the first real holiday of their whole lives. Everyone got gifts. Jackson County was generous that way, white and black alike. Not just sweaters and underwear, but baseball gloves and boxes of tin army men. For one morning, they were like boys from nice houses in nice neighborhoods, where it was quiet at night and nightmareless. Even Turner had cause to smile as he touched up the gingerbread man card and remembered the folk hero's rallying cry, "You can't catch me, you can't catch me." A good way to be. He didn't remember how the story ended. Miss Baker signed off on his work, and he joined Jamie, Elwood, and Desmond over by the papier-mâché station. Desmond whispered, "Jamie says Earl." Desmond found the stuff, but Jamie came up with the scheme. It was an unlikely proposition from a student who had just made it to Pioneer. Almost out. Jamie grew up in Tallahassee, like Elwood, but they couldn't name 2 places they had in common. different neighborhoods, different cities. His father, he'd been told, was a full-time flim-flam man and the part-time regional salesman for a vacuum cleaner company, driving his circuit around the panhandle and knocking on doors. It wasn't clear how he met Jamie's mother, but Jamie was one proof of their acquaintance, and the vacuum cleaner that they lugged from short-term residence to short-term residence was another. Jamie's mother, Ellie, swept up at the Coca-Cola bottling plant on South Monroe in All Saints. Jamie and his gang used to kick around the railroad yard nearby, playing craps, passing around a harrowed copy of Playboy. He was a good kid, not the most diligent about school attendance, but never would have seen the inside of Nickel if not for the depot. An old rummy who haunted the yards stuck his hand down the pants of one of the gang, and they beat him senseless. Jamie was the only one who didn't outrun the deputies. During his term at Nickel, the Mexican boy sidestepped the squabbles that embroiled the rest of them, the uncounted disputes over psychological turf and endless encroachments. His constant dorm reassignments notwithstanding, Jamie kept a quiet profile and conducted himself in accordance with the Nickel Handbook's rules of conduct. A miracle, since no one had ever seen the handbook despite its constant invocations by the staff. Like justice, it existed in theory. Spiking a supervisor's drink lay outside his personality. Nonetheless, Desmond worked in the sweet potato fields. No complaints. He liked the way the potatoes smelled at the cusp of picking time, that warm, peaty scent, like his father's sweat when he came home from work and made sure Desmond was tucked in proper. The previous week, Desmond was part of a team ordered to rearrange a work shed, the big grey one where they kept the tractors. Half the lights were burned out, and critters had made a home in various spots. Spiderwebs canopied one corner, and Desmond stabbed a broom at the white blossoms, wary of what might burst forth. He recognized some of the loose cans stacked there and found a place for them. But there was one green relic too faded to read. He shook it, solid throughout. He asked one of the older boys what to do with it, and the kid said that it shouldn't be in there. That's horse medicine to make them puke when they eat something they shouldn't. The old stables were nearby. Perhaps that junk had ended up here when they closed them down. At Nickel, things tended to end up where they were supposed to, but a lazy or mischievous soul occasionally subverted the order. Desmond hid the medicine in his windbreaker and took it to Cleveland. One of them, no one remembered who, when it was all over, suggested putting it in a staffer's drink. Why else had Desmond taken it? But it was Jamie who made the scheme real in his calm rebuttals to the counter-arguments. "Who would you give it to?" Jamie asked his friends in turn with a rhetorical air. Jamie had a stutter that slunk out when he asked questions. He had an uncle with a quick hand, but the stutter disappeared during the can discussions. Desmond fingered Patrick, a houseman who'd beat him for wetting his bed and made him drag his soiled mattress to the laundry in the middle of the night. That fucking Peckerwood. I'd like to see him puke up his guts. They were in the Cleveland rec room after school let out. No one else around. Occasionally, cheers from one of the sports fields wafted over. "Who would you give it to?" Elwood suggested Duggan. No one knew that he and Duggan had had a dust-up. Duggan was a stout-backed white man who stomped around with a sleepy, cow-eyed look. He had a way of suddenly appearing in front of you, like a puddle or a pothole, and you learned that his big meaty hands were faster than you'd think, pincering shoulder blades, noosing a skinny neck. The supervisor, Elwood told them, had socked him in the stomach for talking to a white student, a kid he'd met in the hospital. Fraternization between the students of the two campuses was discouraged. The boys nodded. Makes sense. But they all knew he really wanted to give it to Spencer, for his legs. No one dared mention Spencer's name anywhere near this daydream, or else they'd never have wasted a breath on it. I'd give it to Wainwright, Turner said. He told them how Wainwright had caught him smoking cigarettes back during his first term at Nickel. Knocked him upside the head so hard it left a lump on his cheek. Wainwright was pale-skinned, but all the black boys knew from his hair and nose that he had some Negro blood. He beat the black boys for knowing what he pretended not to know about himself. I was greener than you, El, back then. No one had caught him smoking since. It was Jamie's turn. He said simply, Earl, and did not elaborate. Why? He knows. The days passed, and they picked up the prank between checkers and ping-pong. Different targets emerged when they saw another student mistreated or suddenly remembered some personal encounter, a reprimand, a box on the ear. One name remained constant, Earl. Elwood dropped Duggan from his rotation and threw in Earl one day. Earl hadn't beat Elwood the night they took him to the White House, but he was not Spencer, Spencer once removed. Close enough. It's possible Elwood already knew the answer when he asked, "What's the holiday luncheon?" The holiday luncheon was marked on the big calendar in the dorm's entrance hall. Desmond said it wasn't for them. It was for the staff. A nice meal in the dining hall to celebrate another year of hard work on the North Campus. And they get to raid the meat lockers for some prime beef to give themselves, Turner said. Boys volunteered for the opportunity to rack up merits by serving as waiters. Desmond said, that would be a good time to do it. Saying it and not saying it. Jaime, as ever, said, Earl. Earl sometimes worked the South Campus, sometimes the North. Under most circumstances, they'd have heard about the bad blood between Jamie and the supervisor, but both of them spent time on the White Half, and who knew what had passed between them down there? It could have been Lover's Lane, some backtalk, a frame-up by one of the white boys. Earl was a regular at the drinking sessions at the motor pool. When the motor pool light was on at night and you heard them carrying on, you prayed you didn't have a beating hanging over your head or that you'd been picked for a date on Lover's Lane. It would end up bad. Strange medicine in an old green can. The boys gathered the words and intonations of a justice spell. Justice or revenge. No one wanted to admit it was a real plan they cooked up all along. They kept returning to it as Christmas approached, passing the idea between them so each considered its heft and cast. As the prank evolved from abstraction to something more solid, full of hows and whens and what-ifs, Desmond, Turner, and Jamie stopped, including Elwood, without realizing it. The prank was against his moral conscience. Hard to picture the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. dosing Governor Orville Forbes with a couple of ounces of lye, and Elwood's beating at the White House had him scarred all over, not just his legs. It had weaveled deep into his personality. The way his shoulders sank when Spencer appeared, the flinch and shrink. He could only stand so much talk of revenge before the reality grabbed a hold of him. Then it popped, and the boys talked about it no more. They'd put us in the ground, Desmond said, when Jamie sparked up another round of who do we get? We have to be careful, Jamie said. I'm going to play some basketball, Desmond said, and he was out. Turner sighed. He had to admit that the game had gotten boring. It was nice for a time to picture one of their tormentors puking all over their yummy spread at the holiday luncheon, spraying all those peckerwoods with his mess, shitting his pants, face gone strawberry red from pain, heaving until what came out wasn't food, but his own dark blood. A pleasant vision, a different kind of medicine, but they weren't going to do it, and that fact spoiled it. Turner stood, and Jamie shook his head and joined them for basketball. Friday, the day of the holiday luncheon, the community service crew was out on rounds. Harper, Turner, and Elwood had just finished up with the 5 and 10 when the supervisor said he had something he had to do. "I'll be back in a hot minute," he told them. "You can wait here." The van disappeared. Turner and Elwood walked up the scrabbly alley to the street. Harper had left them alone before when they were working on a board member's house, never on Main Street. Even after 2 months of back-alley exchanges, Elwood was incredulous. "We can walk around?" he asked Turner. "We don't got to make a commotion, but yeah," Turner said, pretending it had happened before plenty of times. Sightings of nickel students on Main Street were not uncommon. The students shuffled off the grey school buses in their state-issued denim for community service. Real community service, not the special services of Turner and Elwood's assignments, cleaning up rubbish in the park after July 4th fireworks or the Founders' Day parade. Once a season, the choir visited the Baptist church to show off their beautiful voices as Director Hardy's secretaries handed out envelopes for donations. A boy might be found in the company of a supervisor darting into town for business. 2 unescorted colored boys was a sight, however. It was lunch hour. The white people of Eleanor tried to account for them. The boys didn't look shifty or scared. Their supervisor was probably inside the hardware store. Mr. Bonton hated niggers and had made them wait outside. The white folks walked on. It wasn't their business. Christmas toys, wind-up robots, and air guns and painted trains filled the front window of the 5 and 10. The boys knew to hide their enthusiasm over little kid things that still had an allure. They walked quickly past the bank. It seemed like a place where board members might appear, or at least white men with power who signed official documents, like reform school orders. "It's weird being out here," Elwood said. "It's okay," Turner said. "No one watching," Elwood said. The sidewalk was empty, a break in the noon traffic. Turner looked around and smiled. He knew what Elwood was thinking. "Most of them talk about running into the swamp," Turner said. "Wash their scent off so the dogs can't get them, then hide in there until the coast is clear and hitch somewhere, west or north. That's how they get you, though, because that's where everybody runs to. And you can't wash no scent off. That's only in movies." "How would you do it?" Turner had turned it over in his head many times, but had never shared it with anyone. "You head out here into the free world, not the swamp. Snatch clothes from a clothesline. Head south, not north, because they ain't expecting it. Those empty houses we pass on our deliveries. Mr. Tolliver's house. He's always down at the Capitol for business. His house is empty. You raid them for supplies and then put as many miles between you and the dogs as you can, tire them out. The trick is not doing what they know you're going to do." Then he remembered the most important part. "And don't take no one with you. Not one of those dummies. They'll take you down with them." They had ambled to the front of the pharmacy. Behind the window, a blonde woman crouched over a carriage and spooned ice cream into her baby's mouth. The little boy was a mess, smeared with chocolate and bawling with happiness. "You got any money?" Turner said. "More than you got," Elwood said. "No money at all." They laughed because they knew the drugstore didn't serve colored patrons, and sometimes laughter knocked out a few bricks from the barricade of segregation, so tall and so wide. And they laughed because ice cream was the last thing they wanted. Elwood's aversion was understandable. The visit to the ice cream factory had left its marks. Turner hated the stuff on account of his aunt's boyfriend, who moved in with them when Turner was 11 years old. Mavis was his mother's sister and his only family. The state of Florida didn't know about her, thus the blank space on their forms where her name should have been written, but he had lived with her for a time. His father, Clarence, was a bit of a rambler, not that he had to be told, because he had the same affliction. Turner remembered him as two big brown hands and a raspy chuckle. When he heard autumn leaves scuttling in the wind, he remembered that chuckle. The same way nickel boys remembered White House visits when they heard the smart snap of leather decades later. Turner last saw his father when he was 3 years old. After that, the man was the wind. His mother, Dorothy, hung around longer, long enough for her to choke on her own vomit. She had that taste, rot gut, the rougher the better. The stuff she drank the night she died left her twisted and blue and cold on the front room sofa. He knew where she was now, 6 feet under in St. Sebastian Cemetery, which was one thing he had on his upstanding friend Elwood. Elwood's mother and father had lit out west and didn't even send a postcard. What kind of mother leaves her kid in the middle of the night? One that doesn't give a shit. He made a note to save that as a low blow if he and Elwood ever got into a real fight. Turner knew his mother loved him. She just loved liquor more. His Aunt Mavis took him in and made sure Turner had nice clothes for school and 3 meals. The last Saturday of every month, she wore her good red dress and sprayed perfume into her neck and went out with her girlfriends. But apart from that, her life was the hospital, where she worked as a nurse, and Turner. No one had ever called her pretty. She had tiny black eyes, an afterthought for a chin, and when Ishmael started courting her, she fell quick. He called her pretty, and a lot of other things she'd never heard before. Ishmael was a maintenance man at the Houston airport, and when he came by with flowers, they almost hid the industrial odor that permeated his skin, no matter how much he washed. Ishmael was a man of secret menace, who stored up violence like a battery. Turner learned to recognize these men from then on. How Mavis brightened at the thought of him, singing ditties from the movie musicals she loved, locking herself in the hall bathroom with a hot comb while the transistor crackled, in and out of tune. It never occurred to Turner why she wore sunglasses 2 weeks straight that one time, why she stayed in her room some mornings and didn't emerge until past noon, limping with soft moans. The day after Turner put himself between Mavis and Ishmael's fists, Ishmael took him out for ice cream at J. Smith's over on Market Street. Bring this young man the biggest sundae you got, every bite like a sock in the mouth. He ate every miserable spoonful, and ever since it struck him that adults are always trying to buy off children to make them forget their bad actions. Had the flavor of that fact in his mouth when he ran from his aunt's house that last time. Nichols served the students vanilla ice cream once a month, and it made them so squealingly happy, like a bunch of dumb piglets in a sty, that Turner wanted to knock everyone flat. Third Wednesday of the month, Turner and Elwood carried most of the North Campus's ice cream allotment through the back door of the Eleanor Pharmacy. Turner felt he was performing a service for his fellow students, sparing them. The blonde lady pushed the carriage toward the door, and Elwood held the door open for her. She didn't say a word. Harper pulled up and waved them to the front seat. "You boys up to no good?" "Yes, sir," Turner said. He whispered to Elwood, "Don't go stealing my plan now, El. That shit's pure gold." They got in the van. When they drove past the administration building toward the colored campus, the students stood in worried huddles on the green. Harper slowed and called over one of the white boys. "What's happening?" "They took Mr. Earl to the hospital. Something's wrong with him." Harper parked the van by the warehouse and ran to the hospital. Elwood and Turner hustled to Cleveland. Elwood scanning every which way, like a squirrel, and Turner trying to maintain a front, which made him move like a space robot. They needed a report. Despite the segregated campuses, the black boys and white boys passed on news for safety's sake. Sometimes nickel was like being back home, where the older brother or sister that you hated warned you about a parent's black mood or day-long drinking jag so you could make preparations. They found Desmond outside the colored dining hall. Turner looked inside. The staff table was still set in the aftermath. Half set, the overturned chairs pointed to a fuss, and the smear of blood showed where they'd dragged out Earl. "I don't think it was medicine," Desmond said. His deep voice added a baleful tone. Turner punched him in the shoulder. "You're going to get us killed." "It wasn't me. It wasn't me," Desmond said. He looked over Turner's shoulder toward the White House. Elwood's hand covered his mouth. There was a half of a work shoe footprint in the blood. He snapped to and turned downhill to see if they were coming for them. "Where's Jamie?" "That nigger," Desmond said. They strategized on the dining hall steps. Turner suggested that they hang out and gather information on Earl's condition from the other students. He didn't say he wanted to stay there because it was a straight shot to the road bordering the east side of campus. If Spencer came up with a posse, he'd be out lickety-split. "Can't catch me, I'm the gingerbread man." Jamie showed up an hour later, looking rumpled and a bit dazed, like he'd just had a turn on a tilt-a-whirl. He completed the story they'd got from the other boys. The holiday luncheon commenced as it always did. The special tablecloth that only got aired out once a year covered the staff table. The nice dishes were wiped of dust. The supervisors took their places and drank beer, sharing rowdy stories and off-color speculation about the bustier secretaries and teachers. It was loud, and they enjoyed themselves. A few minutes into the meal, Earl bolted up and grabbed his stomach. They thought he was choking. Then he commenced to disperse his insides in a spray. When the blood appeared, they carried him down the hill to the hospital. Jamie told them that he waited among the boys outside the ward until the ambulance took him away. "You're crazy," Elwood said. "I didn't do it," Jamie said. His face was blank. "I was playing football. Everybody saw me." "The can is gone from my locker," Desmond said. "I told you I didn't take it," Jamie said. "Maybe someone robbed your shit, and they did it." He knocked Desmond's shoulder. "You said it was horse medicine." "That's what he told me," Desmond said. "You saw it. It had a horse on it." "Could have been a goat," Turner said. "Maybe it was horse poison," Elwood said. "Or goat poison," Turner added. "They ain't rats, dummy," Desmond said. "You shoot horses, not poison them." "He's lucky he ain't dead then," Jamie said. Elwood and Desmond continued to press him, but his version did not change. It was hard to miss the smile that tugged at Jamie's mouth from time to time. Turner wasn't angry that Jamie lied to their faces. He admired liars who kept on lying even though their lies were obvious, but there was nothing anyone could do about it. Another proof of one's powerlessness before other people. Jamie wasn't going to admit it, so Turner just watched the boys and the activity down the hill. Earl didn't die. He didn't come back to work either. Doctor's orders. They'd hear about that in the coming days. And a few weeks after that, they'd discover that Earl's replacement, a tall man named Hennepin, was made of meaner stuff, and he'd subject many a boy to his cruel whims. But they made it through that first evening without being strung up, and when word came that Dr. Cook blamed Earl's fit on his constitution, he had a family history, it seemed, Turner stopped strategizing his escape. Just before lights out, he and Elwood were hanging out by the big oak in front of the dormitory. The campus had quieted. Turner wanted a cigarette, but his pack was back in the warehouse loft. He whistled instead, that Elvis song Harper kept singing on their runs. The night bugs started up in a wave. "Earl," Turner said, "that's some shit." "Wish I'd been there to see it, though," Elwood said. "Ha! I wish it had been Spencer," Elwood said. "That would have been nice." His palm went to the back of his thigh, to the spot he rubbed when he remembered. They heard a whoop. Down the hill, the supervisors had turned on the Christmas lights, and the boys got a look at the results of all the hard work of the last few weeks. Green, red, and white bulbs sketched a route of holiday cheer along the trees and the South Campus buildings. Far off in the dark, the big Santa at the entrance glowed from the inside with a demonic fire. "Those are some lights," Turner said. Past the White House, blinking lights outlined the old water tower. One of the white kids had fallen from the ladder while nailing them up and had broken his collarbone. The lights floated on the X's of the wooden struts, circled the huge tank, sketched the triangular peak, like a spaceship taking off. It reminded Turner of something. Then it came to him. That amusement park, Fun Town, from the TV commercials. That dumb, happy music, the bumper cars and the roller coaster, and the atomic rocket. The other boys talked about the place from time to time. They'd go there when they were out in the free world again. Turner thought that was stupid. They didn't let colored people in those nice places. But there it was before him, pointed at the stars, decked in 100 flickering lights, waiting for takeoff. A rocket, launched in darkness toward another dark planet they couldn't see. "It looks nice," Turner said. "We did a good job." Elwood said, "What, 3, Chapter 11? Elwood." He grunted in response from the living room, where the window kept a sliver of Broadway below. Sammy's Shoe Repair, the closed-down travel agency, and the median that ran up the avenue. The angle of his vision made a trapezoid, his personal snow globe of the city. It was a good place to smoke, and he'd found a way to perch on the sill that didn't aggravate his back. "I'm going out for a bag of ice. I can't take it anymore," Denise said, and locked the front door behind her. He had given her a set of keys last week. He didn't mind the heat. This city knew how to concoct a miserable summer, sure, but it had nothing on the South on those hot days. The way New Yorkers complained about summer heat, on the subway, in the bodega, made him snicker ever since he got here. There was a garbage strike then too, his first day in the city, but it had been February. It didn't smell as bad. This time, whenever he left the vestibule downstairs, the stench was a thicket. He wanted a machete to hack through it. It was only the second day of the strike, the Wildcat strike of '68, an introduction to the city so wretched that he had to interpret it as a hazing. Steel trash cans mobbed the pavement, overflowing and untouched for days, and the newer garbage in bundled bags and cardboard boxes huddled against them. He avoided public transportation in a new place until he got the lay of it, and he'd never been on a subway before. He walked all the way uptown from the Port Authority. Walking in a straight line was impossible. He weaved around the mounds of refuse. When he got to the Statler, the SRO on 99th Street, the residents had kicked open a path to the front door between two monstrous piles of garbage. Rats zipped back and forth. If you wanted to break into one of the second-floor rooms, all you had to do was scale the trash. The manager gave him a key to a place in the back, 4 flights up. Hot plate with a bathroom down the hall. One of the guys he worked with in Baltimore told him about the flophouse and painted a terrible picture. It wasn't as bad as the guy made it out. He'd stayed in worse places. After a couple of days, he bought cleanser at the A&P and took it on himself to clean the toilet and shower. No one else bothered. That kind of joint. He'd scrubbed Dirty John's plenty of times, plenty of places, on his knees in the stink. Welcome to New York. Down on Broadway, Denise crossed his perch view. Seen from street level, the median was clean most days. From the third floor, you peered over the benches and trees and saw the trash crowding the subway ventilation grates and paving stones, paper bags and beer bottles and tabloids. Now the crap was everywhere, in drifts. With the latest strike underway, everybody saw what he saw all the time. The city was a mess. He stubbed out his smoke in the teacup and made it to the couch without hitting one of those gongs. Ever since he put his back out, he'd feel all right and forget and move too fast, and then gong, a detonation in his spine. Gong while sitting on the toilet, gong while picking up his pants. He yelped like a dog and then curled on the floor for a few minutes, the bathroom tile cool on his skin. It was his own fault. You never knew what was in those drawers and boxes. One time when they were moving this old Ukrainian guy, a cop who got his pension and picked up stakes to Philadelphia, where he had a niece, he bent down to lift a night table and his spine popped. Larry said he heard it from the hallway. The cop kept his free weights in there, 300 pounds of weights, in case he got the urge to lift in the middle of the night. What put his back out last week was a big wooden bureau, harmless looking, but he'd been working extra shifts for money, sleepy and sloppy. You got to watch it with that Danish modern shit, Larry told him. When Denise returned, he'd ask her to fill another hot water bottle, long as she was going to be in the kitchen fixing more rum and cokes. The block was loud most nights with salsa music, and it was louder this evening, what with everyone keeping their windows open because of the heat. Plus, tomorrow was July 4th. Everyone had off. If his back wasn't too troublesome, they were going to Coney Island for the fireworks, but tonight they would stay in and watch The Defiant Ones on Channel 4. Sidney Poitier and Tony Curtis, two convicts chained together on the run through the swamp, dodging hunting dogs and dumb-faced deputies with shotguns. Phony Hollywood crap, but he always watched the movie when it came on, usually on the Late Late Show, and Denise liked Sidney Poitier. His rooms were furnished with cast-offs from work, a kind of showroom for the furniture of New Yorkers from all over the city, in rotation, new stuff coming in and old stuff going out. His queen-size bed with the type of super stiff mattress he liked, the dresser with the fancy brass studs, all the lamps and rugs. People get rid of plenty when they move. Sometimes they're changing not just places, but personalities. Up or down the economic ladder. Maybe the bed won't fit in the new place, or the sofa's too boxy, or they're newlyweds and put a new living room set on their registry. A lot of these white flight families splitting for the suburbs, Long Island and Westchester, they're making a whole new start, shaking the city off, and that means getting rid of how they used to see themselves. Him and the rest of the crew from Horizon Moving had dibs before the junkman got his hands on it. The couch he lay on now was his 12th in 7 years, constantly upgrading. One of the perks of working for a moving company, though it was hell on your back sometimes. He started this New York stint at the SRO, stayed there a few months until he got the job at Four Brothers washing dishes. He moved around a bunch, uptown, Spanish Harlem, until he got a line on the job at Horizon, steady work, and humped it down here to 82nd Street off Broadway. He knew he was going to take the apartment when the landlord threw the door wide. Here, 4 years and counting. I'm middle class now, he joked to himself. Even the roaches were of a noble sort, scurrying when he turned on the bathroom light instead of ignoring his presence. He took their modesty as a touch of class. Denise returned. "Did you hear me outside?" She went into the kitchen and stabbed the bag of ice with a butter knife. "What?" "This rat ran across my feet, and I screamed. That was me," she said. Denise was tall and Harlem tough and could have played basketball in one of the lady leagues. One of these city girls who wasn't afraid of anything. He'd seen her curse out this muscle-bound turkey who whispered something untoward as she passed on the street. She got up in the dude's face, but a rat made her squeal like a little girl. Denise was most definitely not a little girl, so when she let out that part of her, it was always a surprise. She lived on 126th, next to a vacant lot, and the heat, and now the garbage, made the empty lot livelier than usual. The bastards were everywhere, bursting out of their underground hidey holes. She said she saw a rat as big as a dog last night. Barked like one too. He opined that maybe it was a dog, but she wasn't going back today, and he was glad to have her. Her Wednesday night classes were cancelled because of the 4th. He was off too, that afternoon, sleeping when she came over and got into bed with him. Her big silver earrings on the bedside table, courtesy of the Atkinson family, Turtle Bay to York Avenue, 3 kids and a dog and a Gimbel's dining room set, woke him up. By now, she knew the spot on his back where it hurt and needed it, and then told him to roll over and got on top. The room was 10 degrees hotter when they were done, and well tangled up in each other. Warm rum and cokes worked for a while, and then they didn't, and an ice run was in order. They met at the high school up on 131st Street. At night, there were adult classes. He was working on his GED, and she taught ESL to Dominicans and Poles in the classroom next door. He waited to finish the course before he asked her out. Earned his certificate and feeling proud, and it was one of those moments that makes you realize you have no one in your life who cares about the occasional triumph. He'd had the thought of getting his GED in the back of his mind for a while, tended to it like it was a candle flame cupped in his hand out of the wind. He kept seeing the ads on the subway. Complete your studies at night on your own terms, and was so happy to get that piece of paper that he said, "Fuck it," and walked right up to her. Big brown eyes and a bridge of freckles over her nose. On his own terms. He hardly ever did it any other way. Asked her out, and she said no. She was seeing someone. Then a month later, she called him up, and they went out for Cuban Chinese. Denise brought over the rum and cokes with ice. "And I got us some sandwiches," she said. He set up the TV tray, which had been left behind by Mr. Waters when he picked up steaks from Amsterdam Avenue to Arthur Avenue in the Bronx. It folded up so that it fit neat between the couch and the end table, like that. Nobel Prize in Physics to the guy who invented it. "They need to get off their asses and pick it all up," Denise said from the kitchen. "Beam has to pick up the phone and talk to these people." She thought the mayor was a bum and relished the strike for its opportunity of complaint. She listed her gripes as he wrangled the rabbit ears to the best place for Channel 4. The smell, she said, for one, of the rotting food, and the bleach the supers sprayed on top of it. The bleach was for the flies that swarmed over the piles of trash in a gross haze and for the maggots twisting on the pavement. Then there was the smoke. People lit the garbage on fire to get rid of it. He didn't understand this, and he considered himself a student of the human animal. And the limp breezes between the buildings carried the smoke all over. The fire engines screamed as they scattered across the city on the avenues and side streets. That, plus the rats. He sighed. In every argument, he took whatever side, stuck it to the man. Rule 1. Cops and politicians, fat cat businessmen and judges, the assorted motherfuckers working levers. They got 'em by the balls. They should twist, he said. They're working men. Mayor Beam, Nixon, and his bullshit. It was almost enough to make him want to vote. But he avoided the government whenever possible so as not to push his little bit of luck. Why don't you sit down, baby, he said. I'll get it together. I already did it all. Even put the kettle on for his hot water bottle. It whistled. Trash fire smoke snuck in through the window, so he opened the one in the bedroom for cross-ventilation. She was right. It'd be a true hassle if this strike went as long as the last one. It was terrible out there, but it was good for the rest of the city to see what kind of place they were really living in. Try his perspective for a change. See how they liked it. The news anchor offered the holiday weather and gave a brief update on the strike. Talks continue, and told the viewers to stay tuned for the 9 o'clock movie. He tapped her glass with his. You're married to me now. Here's the ring. What? From the movie. Sidney Poitier says it, holding up the chains that bind him to the redneck. You should watch what you say. Sure, the dialogue changed depending on who was saying it and who you said it to. Like the ending of the movie. On the one hand, neither convict made it out, or you look at it the other way, and each of them could have made it to freedom if they'd let the other one die. Maybe it didn't matter. They were fucked either way. He stopped watching the movie a few years later when he realized he didn't watch it because it was sort of corny, or they got the facts wrong, or it marked how far he had come, but because watching it made him sad, and a nutjob part of him sought out that sadness. At a certain point, he learned the smarter play was to avoid the things that brought you low. That night, though, he didn't see the end of the movie because Denise wore a denim skirt and her big thighs sticking out distracted him too much. He reached over when that antacid commercial came on. The defiant ones, then sex, then sleep. Fire engines in the night. Tomorrow morning he had to get up and out. Back pain or no, because at 10 he was going to meet the man and buy the van. He had a roll of bills tucked in his boot under his bed, and he'd missed the satisfaction of adding $20 to it on payday. Tore down the flyer in the laundromat so no one else could beat him to it. A '67 Ford Econoline. Needed a new finish, glossy, but the guys on 125th owed him one. And then he'd supplement his horizon shifts with his own jobs. Weekends, too, bring on Larry so he can pay off his old lady. You couldn't count on the Department of Sanitation, but Larry bellyaching about his child support was as dependable as U.S. Steel. He decided to call his company Ace Moving. A was taken, and he wanted to be at the top of the phone book. It was 6 months before he realized he picked the name from his time at Nickel. Ace, out in the free world to make your zigzag way. Chapter 12, there were 4 ways out of Nickel. 1. Serve your time. A typical sentence fell between 6 months and 2 years, but the administration had the power to confer a legal discharge before then at its discretion. Good behavior was a trigger for a legal discharge if a careful boy gathered enough merits for promotion to ace. Whereupon he was released into the bosom of his family, who were very glad to have him back, or else winced at the sight of his face bobbing up the walk, the start of another countdown to the next calamity, if you had family. If not, the state of Florida's child welfare apparatus had assorted custodial remedies, some more pleasant than others. You could also serve time by aging out. The school showed boys the door on their 18th birthday, quick handshake and pocket change, free to return home or to make their way in the indifferent world, likely shunted down one of life's more difficult trails. Boys arrived banged up in different ways before they got to Nickel and picked up more dents and damage during their term. Often graver missteps and more fierce institutions waited. Nickel boys were fucked before, during and after their time at the school, if one were to characterize the general trajectory. 2. The court might intervene. That magic event. A long-lost aunt or older cousin materialized to relieve the state of your wardship. The lawyer retained by dear mom, if she had the means, argued mercy on account of changed circumstance. Now that his father's gone, we need a breadwinner in the house. Perhaps the judge in charge, a new one or the same sourpuss, stepped in for his own reasons. Like money changed hands. But if there had been bribe money, the boy wouldn't have been cast into nickel in the first place. Still, the law was corrupt and capricious in various measure, and sometimes a boy strolled out through what passed for divine intervention. 3. You could die, of natural causes even, if abetted by unhealthy conditions, malnutrition, and the pitiless constellation of negligence. In the summer of 1945, one young boy died of heart failure while locked in a sweatbox, a popular corrective at that time, and the medical examiner called it natural causes. Imagine baking in one of those iron boxes until your body gave out, rung. Influenza, tuberculosis, and pneumonia killed their share, as did accidents, drownings, and falls. The fire of 1921 claimed 23 lives. Half the dormitory exits were bolted shut, and the 2 boys in the dark third-floor cells were prevented from escaping. The dead boys were put in the dirt of Boot Hill or released into the care of their family. Some deaths were more nefarious than others. Check the school records, incomplete as they may be. Blunt trauma, shotgun blast. In the first half of the 20th century, boys who had been leased out to local families wound up dead sometimes. Students were killed while on unauthorized leave. 2 boys were run over by trucks. These deaths were never investigated. The archaeologists at the University of South Florida noticed that the death rates of those who attempted multiple escapes were higher than those who did not. One speculates. As for the unmarked graveyard, it kept its secrets close. 4th, finally, you could run. Make a run for it and see what happened. Some boys escaped into silent futures under different names in different places, living in shadow, dreading for the rest of their lives the day nickel caught up with them. Most often, runners were captured, taken for a tour of the ice cream factory, and then ushered into a dark cell for a couple of weeks of attitude adjustment. It was crazy to run, and crazy not to run. How could a boy look past the school's property line, see that free and living world beyond, and not contemplate a dash to freedom? To write one's own story for once, to forbid the thought of escape, even that slightest butterfly thought of escape, was to murder one's humanity. One famous nickel escapee was Clayton Smith, his story wending its way through the years. The supervisors and housemen made sure of its longevity. It was 1952. Clayton was not the most likely runaway. Not bright or hale, defiant or spirited. He simply lacked the will to endure. Ground down plenty before he stepped on campus. But nickel magnified and refined the cruelty of the world, opening his eyes to the bleaker wavelengths. If he'd suffered all this in his 15 years, what more lay in store? The men in Clayton's family shared a strong family resemblance. Neighborhood folks recognized them immediately from their hawkish profiles, light brown eyes, the flittering way they moved their hands and mouths when they talked. The similarities persisted beneath the skin, for Smith men were neither lucky nor long-lived. With Clayton, there was no mistaking the resemblance. Clayton's daddy had a heart attack when the boy was 4 years old. His hand, a claw on the bedsheets, mouth wide, eyes wide. At 10, Clayton left school to work in the Manchester orange groves, following his 3 brothers and 2 sisters. The baby of the family, pitching in. His mama's health failed after a bout of pneumonia, and the state of Florida assumed guardianship, scattered the children. In Tampa, they still called Nickel the Florida Industrial School for Boys. It had a reputation for improving a young man's character, whether he was a bad seed or simply had no other place to go. His older sisters wrote him letters that his fellow students read to him. His brothers went this way and that, swept up. Clayton had never learned to fight, not with older siblings around to cow the bullies. At Nickel, he fared poorly in the skirmishes. The only time he felt good and level was when he worked in the kitchen, peeling potatoes. It was quiet then, and he had a system. The house father of Roosevelt at that time was named Freddie Rich, and his employment history was a map of helpless children. Mark G. Giddens House, the Gardenville School for Young Men, St. Vincent Orphanage over in Clearwater, the Nickel Academy for Boys. Freddie Rich identified candidates by their gait and posture. Administration files strengthened the argument, and their treatment by the other boys provided final confirmation. He made quick work of young Clayton, his fingers finding 2 vertebrae that told the boy now Freddie Rich's quarters were up on Roosevelt's 3rd floor. But he preferred to take his prey to the basement of the white schoolhouse, in keeping with Nickel tradition. After that last trip to Lover's Lane, Clayton was done. The 2 supervisors who caught him crossing campus that night were accustomed to seeing the boy walking back to the dormitory unescorted. They let him pass. He had a head start. The boy's plan involved his sister Belle, who'd landed at a home for girls on the outskirts of Gainesville. In contrast with the rest of the family, she enjoyed improved circumstances. The people who ran the home were a kindly sort, enlightened when it came to racial matters. No more corn mash and frayed dresses. She was back in school and only worked on weekends when she and the other girls took in mending. When she was old enough, she wrote Clayton she'd come for him, and they'd be together again. Belle had dressed and bathed him when he was little, and all notions of comfort in his life were an allusion to those early, half-remembered days. The night of his escape, he got to the rim of the swamp, where common sense told him to enter the dark water, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. Too forbidding, between the phantoms, murk, and animal symphony of sex and aggression. The dark had always terrified Clayton, and only Belle knew the songs that soothed him, cradling his head in her lap as he wound her braids in his fingers. He headed east to the edges of the lime fields until he got to Jordan Road. He crept in the woods along the road through first light and into the afternoon. Every car sent him into the burrs and underbrush. When he couldn't take another step, he hid under a lonesome gray house and squatted in the fetid water of the crawl space. Bugs made supper of him, and he caressed the bumps on his skin to see how much he could soothe them without scratching open the bites. The family returned home, a mother and father and teenage girl whom he only saw the feet and knees of. The girl was pregnant, he learned, and this had upturned the order. Or the house had always been a storm, and this was the same weather. He slithered forth when the bickering stopped and they slept. The side of the road was gloomy and fearsome, and the boy had no idea about the direction of his travel, but he was unconcerned. Long as he didn't hear hunting dogs, he was okay. As it happened, the Appalachian hounds were deployed elsewhere, attending to the escape of 3 Piedmont convicts, and Freddie Rich didn't report Clayton's disappearance for 24 hours, scared as a trapped rat that his predations would be uncovered. He'd been dismissed from previous jobs, and he liked the easy bounty of his latest post. Had Clayton ever been alone? In the house on that dead-end street in Tampa, his brothers and sisters were ever on top of him, all of them crammed into the 3 rooms of the rickety shotgun, their nickel with its communal debasements. He wasn't accustomed to so much time with the knocking of his thoughts, which rattled around his skull like dice. He hadn't thought of a future beyond a reunion with his family. On the 3rd day, he concocted a scenario, a couple of years as a cook, then saving up for his own restaurant. Soon after Clayton started picking at the orange groves, Chet's drive-in opened up on a broken stretch of county road. He looked through the slats of the truck on the way to work, waiting for that red, white and blue explosion of the restaurant's facade and steel canopy. They hung the banners, the signs sprouted along the road to tease, and then it opened. Chet's. The young white waiters and waitresses wore smart green and white striped jumpsuits and smiled as they ferried burgers and shakes out to the lot. The slick jumpsuits encoded virtues, industry, self-reliance, those fancy cars, and the hands sticking out to receive. It was inspiring. True, Clayton had never eaten in a restaurant and overesteemed the grandeur of the joint, and perhaps his hunger nourished the idea of owning a dining establishment. As he ran, the vision of his restaurant, walking among the customers to ask how they enjoyed the meal, checking the day's receipts in the back office like he'd seen in movies, kept pace with him. On the 4th day, he was far enough that he decided to hitch. His nickel dungarees and work shirt were a sight. He swiped work clothes from a clothesline after he saw a battered pickup grind away from a big white farmhouse. He cased the house for a spell and snatched overalls and a shirt when he thought it was safe. An old woman on the 2nd floor watched him lope out of the woods and grab them. The work clothes had been her late husband's and repurposed by her grandson. She was glad to watch them go, because it pained her to see them on another person, especially her son's boy, who was cruel to animals and a blasphemer. He didn't care where his ride was headed, as long as it took him a couple of hours' distance. Clayton was starving. He'd never gone this long without eating, and didn't know how to remedy that. But miles were the most important thing. Not many cars passed, and the white faces scared him, even if he was bold enough to take to the asphalt. There were no Negro drivers. Maybe Negroes didn't own cars in this part of the state. He finally forced himself to stick out his thumb when a white Packard with midnight blue trim rounded the bend. He couldn't see the driver, but Packards were the first cars he learned to recognize, and he had a fondness for them. The driver was a middle-aged white man in a cream-colored suit. Of course it was a white man. How could it be otherwise in that car? He wore his blonde hair parted and had silver squares of hair at the temples. His eyes changed from blue to ice white behind his wire-frame eyeglasses, depending on the sun. The man looked Clayton up and down. He beckoned the boy inside. "Where you headed, boy?" Clayton said the first thing that popped into his head. Richards, the name of the street he grew up on. "I don't know it," the white man said. He mentioned a town Clayton had never heard of and said that he'd take him as far as he was going. Clayton had never been in a Packard before. He rubbed the fabric next to his right thigh, where the man couldn't see. It was rippled and yielding. He wondered, after the maze of pistons and valves under the hood, what it'd be like to see how the good men at the plant had put it together. "You live there, boy?" the man asked. "Richards?" He sounded educated. "Yes, sir, with my mama and daddy." "Okay," the man said. "What's your name, boy?" "Harry," Clayton said. "You can call me Mr. Simmons," nodding as if they had an understanding. They drove for a while. Clayton wasn't going to speak unless spoken to, and kept his lips squished to keep something stupid from flying out. Now that it wasn't his two dumb feet moving him, he got agitated and scanned for police cars, rebuked himself for not staying out of sight longer. He pictured Freddie Rich at the head of the posse, holding a flashlight, the sun gleaming off the big buffalo belt buckle Clayton knew so well, the sight of it, the clatter of it, on the concrete floor. The houses got closer together, and the Packard eased through a short main street, the boy sinking in his seat, but trying not to let the man notice. Then they were on a quiet road once more. "How old are you?" Mr. Simmons asked. They had just passed a closed-down Esso station, the pumps rusted to scarecrows, and a white church next to a small graveyard. The ground had settled, sending the tombstones off-kilter so that the graveyard was a mouthful of rotten teeth. 15, Clayton said. He realized who the man reminded him of. Mr. Lewis, their old landlord. Best pay him on the first of the month, or you're out on the street on the second. He got a queasy feeling. The boy made a fist. He knew what he'd do if the man put his hand on his leg or tried to touch his thing. He'd vowed to sock Freddie Rich in the face many times and then stood paralyzed when the time came. But this day, he felt he could actually do it. Drawing strength from the free world. "You in school, boy?" "Yes, sir." It was a Tuesday, he was pretty sure. He counted back. Freddie Rich liked to look him up Saturday nights. Cheaper than a dime a dance, and you get more for your money. "An education is important," Mr. Simmons said. "It opens doors, especially for your people." The moment passed. Clayton spread his fingers on the upholstery as if palming a basketball. How many days before he got to Gainesville? He remembered the name of Belle's home, Miss Mary's, but he'd have to ask around. What kind of city was Gainesville? There was a lot of this plan he had to figure out before he set things up for himself. Belle would devise secret signals and places to meet that only she knew about. She was smart that way. It'd be a long time before she tucked him in again and told him the things that made it all fine. But he could wait it out if she was close. "Hush now, Clayton." That's what he was thinking when the Packard rolled past the stone columns at the foot of the nickel driveway. Mr. Simmons had just retired as the mayor of Eleanor, but he remained a member of the board and kept abreast of the life of the school. 3 white students on the way to the metal shop saw Clayton get out of the car, but didn't know that he was the boy who ran away. And at midnight, the fan bellowed its news to the half-asleep, but that didn't tell them who was getting ice cream. And in those days, the boys didn't know that cars heading out to the school dump in the middle of the night meant that the secret graveyard had welcomed a new resident. It took Freddie Rich to bring Clayton Smith's story to the student population, when he gave it to his latest boy as an object lesson. You could run and hope to get away. Some made it. Most didn't. There was a 5th way out of nickel, according to Elwood. He cooked it up after his grandmother came on visiting day. It was a warm February afternoon, and the families gathered at the picnic tables outside the dining hall. Some boys were local, and their mothers and fathers appeared every weekend with sacks of food, new socks, and news from the neighborhood. But the students came from all over the state, Pensacola to the Keys, and most families had far to travel if they wanted to see their wayward sons. Long trips on stuffy buses, warm juice, and sandwich crumbs tumbling from wax paper onto laps. Work intervened. Distance made visits impossible, and there were some boys who understood that their families had washed their hands of them. On visiting day, after services, the houseman informed the boys whether or not anyone was coming up the hill, and if no one was coming, the boys busied themselves on the playing fields or found distraction in the tables of the woodshop or in the swimming pool. White kids in the morning, colored kids in the afternoon and averted their eyes from the reunions up the hill. Harriet made the trip to Eleanor twice a month, but had missed her last visit because of sickness. She sent a letter telling Elwood it was a chest cold and included some newspaper articles she thought he'd like, an account of a Martin Luther King speech in Newark, New Jersey, and a big color spread on the space race. She looked years older, walking slowly toward him. Her illness had stolen from her already slight frame, her collarbones tracing a line across her green dress. When she spotted Elwood, she halted and let him come close for an embrace. It bought her a moment of rest before the final steps to the picnic table he'd staked out. Elwood held her longer than usual, nuzzling into her shoulder. Then he remembered the other boys and withdrew. Best not to show too much of himself. It had been a long wait for her return, and not just because she had promised some good news the next time she came from Tallahassee. His life at Nickel had slowed to an obedient shuffle. The period after New Year's was unremarkable. The Eleanor deliveries cycled through the regulars a few times, and Elwood knew what to expect at each stop, even reminding Harper more than once that this Wednesday was the top shop and the restaurant beat, like he'd helped out Mr. Marconi back in the tobacco shop. The dormitories were quieter than they'd been through the fall. Fistfights and scuffles were rare, and the White House remained unoccupied. Once it was clear that Earl wasn't going to kick the bucket, Elwood and Turner and Desmond forgave Jamie. Most afternoons they played Monopoly, their game a conspiracy of house rules, obscure covenants, and revenge. Buttons replaced the lost tokens. The more routine his days, the more unruly his nights. He woke after midnight when the dormitory was dead, starting at imagined sounds. Footsteps at the threshold, leather slapping the ceiling. He squinted at the darkness. Nothing. Then he was up for hours, in a spell, agitated by rickety thoughts and weakened by an ebbing of the spirit. It wasn't Spencer that undid him, or a supervisor, or a new antagonist slumbering in room 2. Rather, it was that he'd stopped fighting. In keeping his head down, in his careful navigation, so that he made it to lights out without mishap, he fooled himself that he had prevailed, that he had outwitted Nickel because he got along and kept out of trouble. In fact, he had been ruined. He was like one of those Negroes Dr. King spoke of in his letter from jail, so complacent and sleepy after years of oppression that they had adjusted to it and learned to sleep in it as their only bed. In less kind moments, he had counted Harriet among their number. Now she looked the part, diminished as much as he was, a wind easing after blustering for as long as you could remember. "Can we squeeze in with y'all?" Bert, another boy from Cleveland, one of the Chucks, wanted to share the picnic table. Bert's mother thanked them and smiled. She was young, maybe 25 years old, with a round, open face, harried yet graceful as she juggled Bert's baby sister, who squatted in her lap, hooting at the bugs. Their goofing and play distracted Elwood as his grandmother spoke. They were loud and happy. Elwood and his grandmother were church quiet beside them. Bert was a rambunctious kid, but sweet-hearted from what Elwood had seen. He didn't know the boy well, or his troubles, but he might straighten up and fly right when he got out. His mother waited for him in the free world, and that was mighty, more than most of the boys had. Elwood's grandmother might not be there when he got out. This had never occurred to him before. She was rarely sick, and when she was, she refused to stay off her feet. She was a survivor, but the world took her in bites. Her husband had died young, her daughter had vanished out west, and now her only grandson had been sentenced to this place. She had swallowed the portion of misery the world had given to her, and now There she was, alone on Brevard Street, her family tugged away, one by one. She might not be there. Elwood knew she had bad news because she kept on longer than usual about the goings-on around their corner of Frenchtown. Clarice Jenkins's daughter got into Spelman. Tyrone James was smoking in bed and burned his house down. A new hat store opened up on Macomb. She threw him a bone about the movement. Lyndon Johnson's carrying on President Kennedy's Civil Rights Bill, bringing it to Congress. And if that good old boy is doing right, you know things is changing. Be a whole different thing when you come home, Elwood. Your thumb's dirty, Bert said. Take it out of your mouth. Here's mine instead. He stuck it at his sister, and she grimaced and giggled. Elwood reached across the table and grabbed Harriet's hands. He'd never touched her like that before, as if reassuring a child. Grandma, what is it? Most visitors wept on visiting day at some point, at the sight of the nickel turnoff coming up the road, on departure, with their backs to their sons. Bert's mother handed his grandmother a handkerchief. She turned away to wipe her eyes. Harriet's fingers trembled. He stilled them. The lawyer was gone, she said. Mr. Andrews, the nice, polite white lawyer who'd been so optimistic about Elwood's appeal, had picked up stakes to Atlanta without a word and taken $200 of their money with him. Mr. Marconi had kicked in another 100 after meeting with him, which was out of character, yes, but Mr. Andrews had been adamant and persuasive. What they had on their hands was a classic miscarriage of justice. The lawyer's office was empty when she took the bus downtown to see him, she said. The landlord was showing the office to a prospective renter, a dentist. They looked at her like she was nothing. I let you down, Elle, she said. I'm okay, he said. I just made Explorer. He kept his head down and was rewarded, just like they wanted. There were 4 ways out. In the throes of his next midnight spell, Elwood decided there was a 5th way. Get rid of nickel lip to 13. He never missed a marathon. He didn't care for the winners, those Superman types hunting world records, slapping down that New York asphalt over bridges and up the extra-wide borough avenues. Camera crews in cars trailed them, zooming in on every drop of sweat and veins jumping in their necks, and white cops on motorcycles too, to keep nuts from running out from the sidelines and messing with them. Those guys got enough applause. What did they need him for? The winner last year was this African brother. Dude was from Kenya. This year it was a white guy from Britain, built the same, skin color aside. Look at those legs and you know they're going to be in the paper. Pros, training all year, jetting all over the globe to compete. It was easy to root for the winners. No, he liked the punch-drunk ones, half walking at mile 23, tongues flapping like Labradors, tumbling across the finish line by hook or by crook, feet pounded to bloody meat in their Nikes. The laggards and limpers who weren't running the course, but running deep into their character, down into the cave to return to the light with what they found. By the time they got to Columbus Circle, the TV crews have split. The cone cups of water and Gatorade litter the course like daisies in a pasture, and the silver space blankets twist in the wind. Maybe they had someone waiting for them, and maybe they didn't. Who wouldn't celebrate that? The winners ran alone at the front, then the race course filled up with the pack, the normal Joes crammed together. He came out for the runners bringing up the rear, and for the crowds on the sidewalks and street corners, those New York mobs so oddball and lovely that they summoned him from his uptown apartment by a force he could only call kinship. Every November, the race pitted his skepticism about human beings against the fact that they were all in this dirty city together, unlikely cousins. The spectators stood on tippy toes, bellies rubbing on the blue wooden police barriers that get rolled out for races, riots, and presidents, jostling for sightlines on the shoulders of daddies and boyfriends. Amid the noise of air horns, wolf whistles, and ghetto blasters shouting out old calypso tunes. Go, and you can do it, and you got it. Depending on the breeze, the air smelled of sabrette hot dog carts or the hairy armpit of that tank-topped chick adjacent. To think of those nickel nights where the only sounds were tears and insects, how you could sleep in a room crammed with 60 boys and still understand that you were the only person on Earth. Everybody around and nobody around at the same time. Here, everybody was around, and by some miracle, you didn't want to wring their neck, but give them a hug. The whole city, poor people and Park Avenue types, black and white, Puerto Ricans, on the curb, holding signs and national flags and cheering the people who had been their opponents the day before, in front of them at the A&P checkout, grabbing the last seat on the subway, walking like a walrus, too slow on the sidewalk. Competitors for apartments, for schools, for the very air. All those hard-won and cherished animosities fell away for a few hours as they celebrated a rite of endurance and vicarious suffering. You can do it. Tomorrow it was back to the front, but this afternoon the truce held until the last runner's last cheer. The sun was gone. November decided to remind everybody they lived in its kingdom now, ordering up gusts. He exited the park at 66th, darted between two cops on horses, reflected in the cops' sunglasses as a black minnow. The dispersing spectators thinned when he got off Central Park West. "Hey man, hey, hold up a minute." Like many New Yorkers, he had a crackhead alert system and turned, steeling himself. The man grinned. "You know me, man. Chicky Pete." So it was. Chicky Pete from Cleveland, a man now. He didn't run into a lot of people from the old days, one of the advantages of living up north. He saw Maxwell one time at a wrestling match at the Garden, Jimmy Superfly Snuka, in a steel match swooping through the air like a giant bat. Maxwell was in line at one of the concessions, close enough to see the 6-inch scar on his forehead that leapt over his eye socket and gouged into his jaw. And he thought he saw Pigeon-Toed Birdie once outside Gristides, had that same curly golden hair, but the guy looked straight through him, as if he were in disguise, crossing the border under false documents. "How you doing, man?" His old nickel comrade wore a green jet sweatshirt and red track pants that were a size too big, borrowed. "Hanging in there. You look good." He'd pegged the energy correctly. Chicky wasn't a crackhead, but he'd been around the block a few times with that too raw thing druggies have when they just get out of jail or a clinic. Here he was, slapping him 5, grabbing his shoulder, and talking too loud in a performance of gregariousness. A walking flinch. "My man, Chicky Pete. Where you headed?" Chicky Pete proposed a beer. Drinks on him. He begged off, but Chicky Pete wouldn't hear of it. And after the marathon, perhaps a test of goodwill for his fellow man was in order. Even when the fellow man hailed from dark days. He knew Chips from his 82nd Street days before he moved uptown. Columbus was a sleepy stretch when he came to the city. Everything closed by 8, tops, and then neighborhood joints opened up on the avenue, singles bars and restaurants that took reservations, like everywhere in the city. It's a dump, and then presto, it's the in thing. Chips was a proper saloon. Bartenders who tracked your usual decent burgers, conversation if you want it, and a nod if you don't. The only time he remembered something racial happening, this cracker in a Red Sox cap started going nigger this and nigger that and got kicked out in a hot minute. Horizon guys like to duck in on Mondays and Thursdays, Annie's shifts, on account of her buyback policy and her bosom, both generous. After he got Ace up and running, he sometimes took his employees out and brought them here, until he learned that if he drank with the guys, they took liberties, show up late, or no-show with lame excuses, or scruffy, their uniforms rumpled. He paid good money for those uniforms, designed the logo himself,